let's dive into something I think a lot of you are wrestling with out there. It's your own spiritual journey and how that kind of intersects with what it means to be a man in today's world.
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack there.
And we've got some seriously interesting sources for this deep dive.
I was really impressed with how these sources just go for it, you know? They don't shy away from the tough stuff, the big picture questions about truth and reality. That's what I found so compelling.
Absolutely. They go deep. And one of those big ideas they tackle right off the bat is this whole red pill thing.
Right.
Now, everyone's heard that phrase from the Matrix, but how does that translate to real life? Like, what does it mean for guys, especially in the married red pill community, which I know a lot of our listeners are part of?
Well, it's about choosing to see, the world for what it is, even the parts that are hard to look at, even the parts that challenge those comfortable narratives we've been given. And I think in the context of marriage and relationships, the red pill lens is encouraging men to step back and question those assumptions, the societal and cultural assumptions they've been living with. It's about stripping away layers of conditioning and seeing the dynamics at play for what they really are.
Yeah, it's so true.
Yeah.
And one of the things that struck me is that these sources often present this red pill awakening as being kind of in opposition to something they call cultural Marxism,
Right.
which is a loaded term for sure. So how are they using it in this context?
Yeah, it's a complex concept.
Very much so.
But the way these sources use it, it's basically describing a set of ideologies that they believe are working to break down those traditional values. They see it as this force that's seeped into everything. Media, education, our legal system, and they argue it's subtly changing societal norms in a way that, from their perspective, is undermining both masculinity and genuine spiritual understanding. But it's super important to say here, we're simply laying out the ideas, not endorsing any specific political view. We're just trying to give you the unvarnished perspective from these sources.
We're staying neutral.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just unpacking it. So it sounds like this red pill perspective encourages men to question not just their relationships, but the very systems, the belief systems that shape their lives.
Precisely. And as they're questioning, these sources really push for a reliance on rational thought. They emphasize critical thinking. Don't just blindly accept what you're told. Question
In everything.
Right. Seek out evidence and use logic to arrive at your own conclusions. That's a huge theme running through all of this.
But isn't there a danger in getting too hung up on rationality? Especially when you're talking about spirituality. I mean, where does intuition fit in? The symbolism, all those aspects that aren't so easily, put under a microscope.
That's a great point. And actually, the sources address that directly.
Okay.
They're not saying you should reject intuition or symbolism, but they suggest that your intellect can help you understand and interpret those things better.
Okay.
Think of it like this, maybe. Reason, it's like it can lead the path,
Yeah.
but intuition is what guides you along it.
I like that. It's about finding that balance.
Absolutely.
Now, we can't talk about a masculine perspective on spirituality without talking about this idea of the divine masculine.
Right.
This phrase that comes up all the time. But what does it really mean in this context?
Well, the sources, they present the divine masculine as like an embodiment of these core principles.
Okay.
Strength, courage, and yeah, even that rationality we were just talking about. But, and this is important, it's not about being, aggressive or dominant. It's about cultivating those qualities within yourself as you move forward on your spiritual journey.
And how does that relate to the divine feminine, which the sources also touch on? Are those two forces at odds?
Not at all, actually. They're like two sides of the same coin.
Oh, interesting.
The divine feminine, it represents these principles like intuition, nurturing, that sense of holistic well-being.
Good.
And both energies, the masculine and the feminine, they're both essential for a balanced and truly fulfilling spiritual experience.
So it's about integrating both those aspects within yourself, the masculine and the feminine, which, if I'm understanding correctly, is kind of what this whole red pill journey is all about.
Yeah.
A more holistic understanding of who you are.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another fascinating idea that the sources really dig into: synchronicity. That idea that I know a lot of people in the red pill community are fascinated by.
Those little coincidences, those things that happen that make you wonder if there's a deeper meaning, some kind of pattern at play.
Yeah, exactly. Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, he believed events could be connected not just by, cause and effect, but by meaning. And these sources get into some pretty compelling examples of synchronicity. Like there's this story about a man who, through a series of seemingly random events, he ends up finding this deeper spiritual understanding.
Wow.
It's pretty wild.
It makes you wonder if those, those seemingly random things that happen to us, maybe they're not so random after all. Maybe they're like little signposts,
Yeah.
guiding us along the way.
That's an interesting way to think about it.
Yeah, but then how do we learn to recognize those signs? How do we interpret them? That's something I'd love to get into as we go deeper with these sources.
Yeah, for sure. We'll definitely come back to that.
But for now, maybe we should shift gears a little and look at the more practical side of things. The sources talk a lot about the role of rituals and discipline in spiritual growth. So how do those fit into this whole red pill perspective?
Well, from what I'm gathering, it seems like they see rituals as a way to carve out that sacred space in your life, like a way to step outside of the everyday grind and connect with something deeper.
And discipline is what allows you to actually show up for that connection consistently.
That's a great way to put it. They use examples like meditation or sweat lodge ceremony, and they really emphasize how powerful those rituals can be, how they can lead to self-discovery and transformation.
Right. And discipline in this context, it's not about being rigid or punishing yourself.
No, not at all.
It's about making choices that align with your spiritual goals, even when they're hard.
That's exactly it. It's about aligning your actions with your aspirations. And they draw these parallels to figures like the Buddha, whose commitment to meditation led him to profound enlightenment. It's about that level of dedication.
Right. But even with the best intentions, the sources acknowledge that this path to enlightenment, or whatever you want to call it, it's not always easy.
Right. It's definitely not a walk in the park.
They talk about obstacles and challenges that come up, particularly for men who are trying to navigate a world that can feel hostile to their masculinity.
Absolutely. They point to these societal pressures to conform.
Right.
The fear of being judged or, ostracized for not fitting in. And even just the difficulty that a lot of men have in processing emotions in a healthy way. It's a lot to unpack, and we'll definitely dig deeper into those challenges later on.
For sure. But before we move on, I'm curious, what's really resonating with you so far from everything we've talked about?
I think for me, it's that emphasis on taking responsibility. Like the sources are really pushing men to own their spiritual journey, question the narratives they've been given, and actively create a life that aligns with their values.
I agree. And it's clear that this journey requires a balance, reason and intuition, honoring the masculine and the feminine within yourself.
Absolutely. It's a journey of self-discovery. It's about breaking free from those limiting beliefs. And ultimately, it's about becoming the best version of yourself.
Well said. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
But this is really just the beginning of our exploration. There's so much more to unpack in these fascinating sources.
I'm really looking forward to diving in deeper.
Me too. But for now, let's leave you with a question to chew on.
Okay.
How can you apply the principles we've talked about today? This idea of questioning, seeking truth, embracing both the masculine and feminine. How can you apply that to your own unique path?
It's a great question to ponder.
It is. And we'll be back after a quick break to explore that even further.
As we were going through these sources, one thing that really jumped out at me was how they connect personal growth with a deeper understanding of creation itself.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like they seem to be saying that if we can grasp how the universe came to be, that's a key to understanding our place within it.
It makes you think, doesn't it? Like where we come from, the forces that set everything in motion. It's got to inform who we are and how we move through the world.
Exactly. And what I found fascinating was how they delve into both the biblical creation story in Genesis and the scientific Big Bang theory.
Right.
And they actually highlight some pretty interesting parallels between those two seemingly very different narratives.
I've always thought of those as being, completely opposite viewpoints.
Yeah, I think a lot of people do.
So how do they reconcile them?
Well, instead of presenting them as mutually exclusive, they suggest looking at the underlying themes.
Okay.
Both narratives involve this incredibly powerful creative force that sets everything in motion.
Right.
And they're saying it's not necessarily about taking sides, picking one over the other,
right,
but more about acknowledging that both perspectives can offer different layers of understanding.
So it's more about exploring the questions than finding a definitive answer.
Exactly. And again, we see that emphasis on questioning, on critical thinking that's so central to the red pill philosophy.
Mm-hmm. It's about owning your own beliefs, not just accepting what you've been told.
Right. Which actually brings us to another really interesting area that these sources explore the psychology of religion.
Okay. What's the takeaway there?
Well, they spend a lot of time unpacking the role of faith, dogma, and ritual in shaping our beliefs and practices.
Mm-hmm.
And they present faith not as, blind belief,
Right.
but as this really potent psychological force that can drive us towards healing, hope, and even, societal change.
But, we've seen how faith can be misused too, right?
Oh,
It's
absolutely.
not always a force for good.
The sources acknowledge that for sure. They talk about how faith has been used to justify, some truly horrific things throughout history.
Yeah.
And they really emphasize the importance of using faith responsibly, ethically,
Right.
and in a way that aligns with your own personal values.
So it's about wielding that power wisely.
Yeah.
Now, what about dogma? That seems a bit more rigid,
Yeah.
like a set of rules you're supposed to follow without question.
Yeah, they present dogma as kind of a framework,
Right.
like a set of beliefs and practices that provide structure to a religious tradition.
Okay.
It can offer a sense of belonging and security, for sure,
Mm-hmm.
but it can also become really restrictive if it's not approached with an open mind.
So again, it's about finding that balance, isn't it?
Yeah.
Honoring tradition, but also being willing to question and critically examine the beliefs that you're holding.
Exactly. The sources are really big on question. Like, it's crucial for spiritual growth. It's about understanding the why behind the what, not just blindly accepting what you're told.
That makes sense. And finally, we have ritual.
Right.
What role do they play in all of this?
Well, from a psychological perspective, they provide a tangible way to connect with, the divine or with your own inner world. They create this sense of sacred space, of stepping outside of your everyday routine and into this realm of deeper meaning.
It's almost like a portal to another dimension,
I like that, yeah.
a way to tap into something beyond the mundane.
And the sources give some really powerful examples, like the sweat lodge ceremonies used by Native American culture.
Right.
Those rituals can be incredibly transformative, helping people confront their shadows and find healing.
It sounds intense,
It can be, yeah.
but also cathartic, like really cleansing.
Yeah, it can be both. But the key takeaway, I think, is that rituals are tools.
Okay.
And like any tool, they can be used effectively or ineffectively.
Right.
It's about approaching them with intention and awareness, understanding the power they hold.
Okay, so we've got faith, dogma, and ritual.
Right.
What else do these sources cover when it comes to this whole psychology of religion thing?
Oh, they go pretty deep.
Okay.
They talk about the interplay of conscious and unconscious thoughts, the power of symbols to evoke these really deep emotional responses, and even how our early childhood experiences shape our belief system. It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it seems like our subconscious plays a much bigger role in our spirituality than we realize.
Absolutely. And the sources suggest that tapping into your unconscious through things like dream analysis or meditation,
Right.
that can unlock some really profound spiritual insights.
It's like opening a door to a whole other world within yourself.
Exact. But maybe let's shift gears a bit here.
Okay.
Another big topic these sources tackle is free will and its role in spiritual growth. I mean, that's a question philosophers and theologians have been wrestling with forever.
Oh, yeah, for centuries.
And what's interesting is that they don't offer any easy answers.
Sure.
They explore different viewpoints, determinism, the idea that everything's predetermined,
Right.
Bullism, the idea that free will exists within certain limits.
That's a lot to wrap your head around. I mean, does free will even exist? Or are we just playing out a script that's already been written?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And the sources don't claim to have the definitive answer.
Okay.
But they do emphasize that regardless of where you stand on the free will debate, taking responsibility for your choices is essential.
So even if your choices are limited, you still got to own them.
Exact. And that brings us back to that red pill idea of personal responsibility.
Right. It all comes back to that.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that you have the power to choose how you respond to any situation, even if you can't control the situation itself.
It's about being an active participant, not just a passive observer.
That's it. And bringing this back to the masculine perspective, the sources seem to suggest that rationality plays a particularly important role for men in their spiritual growth.
Okay. How so?
Well, they challenge this idea that spirituality is purely an emotional or intuitive realm. They argue that reason and logic are vital, especially in a world where, from their perspective, cultural Marxism promotes a more emotional, less rational way of looking at things.
So it's about using your intellect to kind of cut through the noise.
Yeah,
That
exactly.
see through the manipulation, the propaganda, whatever might be clouding your judgment.
That's a great way to put it. And they draw examples from different spiritual traditions.
Okay.
Buddhism, Catholicism, where logic and reason are a big part of understanding those teachings.
Right.
It's not about blind faith, but about using your mind to engage with those concepts.
But doesn't that risk making spirituality too dry, too intellectual?
It's a valid concern.
Yeah, where's the room for intuition and feeling?
Well, the sources are clear that rationality shouldn't replace those things. It should complement them. It's about finding that sweet spot where reason illuminates the path and intuition guides your steps along the way.
Right, okay. Now, you mentioned cultural Marxism earlier.
Yeah.
How does that tie into this emphasis on rationality?
Well, the way they see it, cultural Marxism, as they define it, is this force that's trying to undermine reason and logic.
Okay.
And instead, it promotes this worldview based on feelings, victimhood,
Right.
and a rejection of traditional values. So from their perspective, it's directly opposed to this rational, self-responsible approach to spirituality they're advocating for.
So it's like a battle of ideologies.
Yeah, you could say that. They argue that by really embracing rationality, men can resist those influences and stay clear-headed.
Okay.
Think for themselves.
Right, reclaim that agency. Okay, that makes sense. Now, we've talked a lot about the red pill and the divine masculine, but these sources also mention the divine feminine.
Mm-hmm.
How does that fit into this predominantly masculine approach to spirituality?
Well, I think it's important to remember that these concepts aren't about gender roles.
Yeah.
The divine masculine and the divine feminine, they represent these fundamental principles, energies that exist within all of us,
Right.
regardless of our biological sex.
So it's not about being a man or a woman, but about embodying both of those energies.
Exactly. The divine masculine might be associated with strength, action, rationality, that sort of thing.
Right.
But the divine feminine encompasses intuition, nurturing, receptivity.
Mm-hmm.
And the sources really stress that finding a balance between those two is essential.
It's about integrating both sides of yourself to become more whole.
Exact. And they suggest that this is especially important for men.
Okay.
In a world where traditional masculinity is often, under fire,
Right.
it's not about rejecting the feminine,
Mm-hmm.
but about honoring both aspects of your being.
It's about embracing the full spectrum of human experience.
That's a great way to put it. Okay, I think we're starting to get a clearer picture of what this red pill, this masculine path, looks like.
Yeah, but how do you actually walk that path?
What are the steps?
How does this translate into action?
That's a great question, and it's something we'll definitely explore in the next part of our deep dive. But for now, I'll leave you with this thought. The sources suggest that this path is a journey of self-discovery,
Okay.
of confronting your shadow self,
Right.
integrating reason and intuition, and ultimately embodying those principles of strength, courage, and resilience that are often associated with the divine masculine.
It sounds like a hero's journey,
It does, doesn't it?
a quest to become the best version of yourself.
Exact. But as we've discussed, it's not a journey without its challenges.
Right, and we'll delve into those challenges
Will.
and how to overcome them
Yeah.
in the next part of our deep dive.
Stay tuned.
Okay, so we've really been unpacking some heavy stuff here.
Yeah.
Creation narrative, psychology of religion, this whole idea of free will and responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
It's clear these sources are really advocating for a hands-on approach to spiritual growth,
Yeah, very active.
especially for men.
Right. They're challenging men to, step up and own their lives. Their spiritual journey. It's not about just waiting around for enlightenment to hit you. It's about creating the conditions for it.
And a big part of that seems to be this idea of discipline,
Right.
which, not always the most fun word.
Yeah, it can have some negative connotations, for sure.
People think of restriction, punishment,
Mm-hmm.
but in this context, it's presented as something totally different.
Yeah, it's about making choices
Right.
that align with your spiritual goals, even when those choices are tough.
It's about choosing long-term growth over, that instant gratification,
Exactly.
putting in the work even when it's hard.
Right. And they give some really good examples, like, the Buddha.
Yeah.
His commitment to meditation is what allowed him to reach enlightenment.
Right.
Or even like Steve Jobs.
Oh, interesting.
His focus and discipline were legendary.
Yeah.
And that drove his success, both personally and professionally.
It's like they understood that real freedom comes from mastering yourself, and discipline is the key to that.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight. But it's important to remember that discipline in this context isn't about becoming, some rigid, unfeeling robot.
Right.
The sources talk about finding balance.
Okay.
Creating a structure that supports your growth but doesn't stifle your creativity.
It's about finding a rhythm that works for you.
Oh,
A sustainable approach to spiritual practice.
Yeah, and it might involve trying different things, experimenting with different techniques, rituals,
Right.
different ways of connecting with yourself and with something bigger.
It's like designing a personalized training program
I like that.
for your soul.
Yeah, a soul workout routine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And just like with any good training program, consistency is key.
You hear that a lot, right? Consistency.
Oh yeah, all the time.
But what does that actually look like when we're talking about spiritual practice?
That's a good question.
It's about showing up regularly, even when you don't feel like it. Making those practices a non-negotiable part of your life, like brushing your teeth
Okay.
or eating breakfast. You just do it.
So it's about creating a habit, a routine that's just ingrained in your day-to-day.
Exactly. And that consistency, the sources emphasize this, that's what allows for real progress. It's the small daily actions over time
Right.
that lead to big changes.
It's like compound interest,
Yeah, exactly.
but for your soul.
It's about trusting that even when you don't see those immediate results, the work you're putting in now, it's planting seeds that will grow.
Right. But life happens, you know?
It does.
What about when things get crazy and you just can't stick to that routine?
The sources talk about that too. They stress the importance of being flexible.
Okay.
It's okay to adapt your practices,
Right.
you know. It's not about being rigid,
Right.
dogmatic. It's about balance between discipline and adaptability.
So it's about being kind to yourself.
Yeah.
Life throws curveballs.
It does. It does.
And you're not going to be perfect all the time.
And that's okay. You can always get back on track.
Right. You can always come back to it.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
But with all the different spiritual paths out there,
Right.
how do you know which practices to be consistent with?
That's where discernment comes in.
Okay.
The sources, they really encourage exploration. Try different things, see what resonates with you.
Right.
Don't just follow somebody else's dogma blind. Find what feels authentic.
So trust your gut.
Yeah, that inner compass. And be open to trying new things.
Right.
What works for you might not work for someone else, and that's totally fine.
It's like finding the right key for your own unique lock.
I like that.
And once you find that key, consistency, discipline, all that becomes easier
It does.
because you're doing something that actually matters to you.
Exactly. Now, along with all of that, these sources really emphasize self-reflection.
Why is that so important?
Well, it's about taking that time to really look inward.
Okay.
Examine your thoughts, beliefs, your motivations.
Yeah.
It's like holding up a mirror to your soul.
Yeah.
And seeing yourself, honestly, the good and the bad.
It's about facing those shadow parts of yourself.
Exactly. And that can be uncomfortable.
Oh, for sure.
You might not like what you see,
Right.
but the sources really drive home the point that that confrontation is essential.
Okay.
It's about integrating those darker parts of yourself, not denying them.
It's like shining a light into those dark corners.
Yeah.
And realizing, hey, it's not as scary as I thought.
I love that. And they suggest different ways to cultivate that self-awareness, like journaling, meditation, even therapy.
Right.
It's about creating space for quiet contemplation, for that honest self-assessment.
Taking inventory of your soul.
Exactly. And it's an ongoing process.
Yeah, it's not a one-time thing.
As you grow and evolve, new layers will be revealed.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. Sometimes you cry, but ultimately, it's freeing.
Right. Now, along with self-reflection, they also talk about finding meaning and purpose.
Okay.
Why is that important for a spiritual journey?
I think it's about connecting to something bigger than yourself. Whether that's a spiritual tradition, a community, a cause.
Right.
It's about figuring out your place in the grand scheme of things, what you're here to contribute.
That's a great way to put it. And the sources suggest that that sense of purpose is like fuel for your growth.
Okay.
It gives you direction, motivation, a sense of belonging.
It's like having a compass
Yeah.
to guide you through all the ups and downs.
Exactly. And it's not always a fixed point either, that sense of purpose.
Right, it can change.
It can evolve as you do.
To stay open to new possibilities,
Right.
let your purpose unfold.
And recognize that meaning and purpose can be found in the everyday stuff too.
It's about finding the sacred in the ordinary.
Beautifully said. And that's something you can cultivate through practices like mindfulness and gratitude.
So shift your perspective. See the world with wonder and appreciation, even when things are tough.
Exactly. That shift in perspective, it can be incredibly powerful.
Okay, well, we've covered a ton of ground here.
We have.
It's been a really fascinating look at this whole red pill perspective.
Yeah.
The masculine path to enlightenment and all the different tools and practices that can help along the way.
What are some of the key takeaways for you?
I think for me, it's that reminder that we're not just passengers. You know, we have the power to choose, to act, to create the life we want. And that includes our spiritual growth. It doesn't just happen. It's something we have to work towards.
I agree. And these sources really provide a roadmap, you know, a set of principles and practices that can help men navigate this journey with more clarity and purpose.
Right? They emphasize discipline, consistency, flexibility, self-reflection, and the importance of finding meaning.
It's about becoming the hero of your own story.
Love that. And on that note, I want to leave you with a final question to ponder. What one small step can you take today to move closer to your own vision of enlightenment? What practice, ritual, insight has really resonated with you?
It's a great question to think about.
It is. Remember, even the smallest step can make a difference. It's about building momentum, creating a ripple effect.
And if you're looking for even more insights, be sure to check out the book that inspired this whole deep dive.
Yeah, definitely.
You can find it on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
It's a goldmine of wisdom, for sure.
Until next time, keep seeking, keep growing, and keep believing in the power of transformation.